Dear Michael, dear Fausto, dear Panos, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to express my deep thanks to the Israel Cardiac Society, Heart Society, for inviting me again to Israel. I always enjoy the hospitality and the beauty of this country and consider it a particular privilege to be here. On Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, we have 3 full days working on electrophysiology at the European Heart House. That's why I asked the chairman whether I could jump up to give the first presentation in order to catch my flight to go down there. I would like to share with you new horizons for the treatment of atrial fibrillation, talking about pathophysiology, clinical trials, and new technologies in the field as well. Atrial fibrillation continues to be the fastest growing segment in interventional electrophysiology. And that explains why there is so much investment of brains first in the field of atrial fibrillation to understand the arrhythmia better, to treat the arrhythmia better, and to reduce the complications that are related to atrial fibrillation. The prevalence of atrial fibrillation, which we now consider as an electrical disease of the heart, is increasing. 10 years ago, we calculated 1.2%. Now we are at 2.3% throughout Europe, and projections indicate that there will be a further dynamic increase in atrial fibrillation in most societies to come in the next couple of decades. So what do we know about atrial fibrillation? One of the key questions when it comes to the pathophysiology of atrial fibrillation is the question, why does atrial fibrillation progress? Is it AF dependent or atrial fibrillation independent? And what can we do to stop this progression of the electrical disease and thereby stopping the complications related to atrial fibrillation, especially stroke and development of heart failure? This is one of the graphs that Paulus Kirchhoff set up a couple years ago, and I think it shows very, very nicely what we can observe in most patients with atrial fibrillation, that after the first diagnosis of atrial fibrillation and a time where the patient seems to be quite stable and persistent in paroxysmal atrial fibrillation, there is progression and chronification to long-standing persistent first cardioversions, antiarrhythmic drug therapy, long-standing persistent, and maybe even permanent atrial fibrillation. However, we have not fully understood why this happens and what are the dynamics of this process. And most interestingly, we have not answered the question, can we stop that process, or is this process independent of all interventions that we use? So it is of particular interest to answer the question, what mechanisms and factors govern the dynamics of atrial fibrillation progression. To put it into a clinical frame, we have patients that progress and chronify atrial fibrillation within months, or we have even patients where persistent atrial fibrillation is the first manifestation of the arrhythmia, and we have others that do not progress at all. And one of the questions that I consider particularly interesting is whether or not this dynamics of progression and the mechanisms responsible are the same in all patients. I don't think so. I don't believe that it's the same, and I think that we have to reverse a little bit our view on atrial fibrillation, that it's all the same type of disease, and I will share some arguments with you. And as I said before, we see these patients in the clinic and in our practice that do not progress and that stay paroxysmal for a long, long time. The other side of the spectrum is a patient like this that chronifies fastly, and the question whether or not there is pathophysiologically defined a point of no return remains of particular interest. The traditional concept that we have been followed for a long, long time to better explain the progression of atrial fibrillation was AF begets AF, built on the beautiful work of Maurits Alesi, one of the true godfathers of atrial fibrillation pathophysiology. However, we should not forget that this assumption that atrial fibrillation begets atrial fibrillation and that it's a self-perpetuating form of arrhythmia, like a vicious circle, the more you have, the more you get, is based on animal experimental data taken from healthy sheep. And whether or not this is the same mechanism pathophysiologically in humans has never been fully answered and addressed. It fitted very well in our clinical view on atrial fibrillation to explain that nicely, that the first episode of atrial fibrillation seeds the second, third, and fourth one with an atrial fibrillation-induced atrial remodeling on a cellular electrophysiological basis, but also on a structural basis with the induction of fibrosis. So the belief was that at the beginning of the whole disaster, there is atrial fibrillation. I don't believe that this is solid and true for the vast majority of patients. I believe that there are structural abnormalities on a genetic basis or genetically confined that lead to structural changes that seed out for atrial fibrillation. We have the usual suspects that we believe are the key drivers for atrial fibrillation: hypertension, age, ejection fraction, valvular heart disease. With the exception of valvular heart disease, for none of these factors, it has been clearly shown that there is a causal relationship with atrial fibrillation. That there is some relation is clear, but that you have AF because you are getting older, that you have AF because you have hypertension, that you have AF because you have reduced ejection fraction has never been clearly shown. And there are data indicating that at least for age and hypertension, this relation needs to be questioned. So thoughts about AF begets AF, as I said before, it's based on animal experimental data from healthy goats and has maybe less to do with human atrial fibrillation, and I say that with all respect to Maurits LSE, as we believed in the years ago. Whether the atrial remodeling is a consequence or AF, or whether AF is a consequence of the remodeling process is really one of the key questions. I will put it into very practical frame. If AF is the first point where the development of disease starts, ablation of AF should be able to stop the process. If this is not the case, then it is questionably whether atrial fibrillation can be stopped by means of catheter ablation. I personally believe that at this point in time, the most likely answer to this question is that it is not the same pathophysiology in most patients, that we can stop the arrhythmia in some and that we are unable to stop it in others. Evolving concepts for the pathophysiology of atrial fibrillation include more factors, like the genetic factors, inflammation, obesity, and, as I said before, a genetic predisposition. And I believe that this perspective on atrial fibrillation comes a lot closer to what may be the real pathophysiology of this electrical disease, and that we have to explore that further. If you go into histologic studies, you clearly see that the relation between comorbidities and atrial fibrillation induced remodeling fibrosis is not there. This has been shown by own data. It has been shown recently by post-mortem data from humans as well. We have followed these lines with, I would say, a very intense approach, taking atrial biopsies from patients with different stages of atrial fibrillation in order to explore whether there is a substrate, what the substrate is, and what drives the substrate. The solution to a certain extent for this problem of understanding the progression of atrial fibrillation is in imaging. For me, as an interventional electrophysiology, it hurts. For Fausto, who's an imager, he says, this is great. It is in imaging, it is in MRI. I deeply believe that MRI, substrate visualization, non-invasively, will explain to us what drives atrial fibrillation, who progresses, and why some patients progress and others do not. Look at this patient. I took this data from a recent review article from Nasir Marouche, one of the leaders of the field of MRI technology. And here you have a patient that did not progress at all. Here you have a patient that shows a huge progression of fibrosis, and both patients have the same drivers. Both patients had hypertension, both patients had the same age and aged over time for 3 years. One patient develops huge areas of fibrosis with an increase of 16%, the other did not. Very interesting. We will take a quick look to three clinical trials that I consider interesting when it comes to new horizons of atrial fibrillation. We stay in the field of fibrosis, and I just would like to give brief credit and reference to this paper from Nasir Marouche, who opened up the door for fibrosis visualization. As you can see here, at different stages of fibrosis involvement, Utah 1 to 4, and he was able to show that with more fibrosis, the likelihood to have successful catheter ablation of atrial fibrillation decreases. Very useful, and I personally believe that in the foreseeable future, we will do therapy stratification of potential candidates for catheter ablation of atrial fibrillation before we do the procedure, to find out who has a high likelihood of success and to find out who may not have the optimal characteristics to profit from catheter ablation. STAR-AF2 compared different treatment strategies for persistent atrial fibrillation. To a certain extent, we interventional electrophysiologists and ablationists were driven by the idea that with ablation in advanced stages of atrial fibrillation, a lot helps a lot. Ablate a lot, and then you will gain success. STAR-AF2 compared 3 different treatment strategies in persistent atrial fibrillation patients to give some more solidity to the assumption that a lot helps a lot. And they compared in a prospective randomized fashion pulmonary vein encircling with pulmonary vein encircling plus so-called café ablation, or pulmonary vein encircling with linear lesion ablation. And as you can see on this slide, the outcome was completely identical for all 3 treatment strategies, indicating that burning down every living atrial myocyte might not be the perfect solution to treat patients with persistent atrial fibrillation. I fully support that approach, as I believe, and we close the gap again to MRI imaging, that we need to better understand where the disease is and that we need to treat the patient where the disease is and not where we believe that treatment may be beneficial. Fire and Ice has been published just a couple days ago by Karl-Heinz Cook at the ACC meeting in Chicago. It's a very interesting trial that compares radiofrequency catheter ablation with cryoballoon ablation in patients with paroxysmal atrial fibrillation to end up the debate what is better than the others, or to come up with clear data showing that they are equivalent. Cryoablation is balloon-based, as you know, for isolation of the pulmonary vein, and that was compared with radiofrequency point-by-point ablation in roughly 700 patients with paroxysmal atrial fibrillation. Relatively healthy patients with atrial fibrillation, 370 in each group. And as you can see, there was no difference in the recurrence of atrial fibrillation between the cryo group and the radiofrequency group. I believe it's a very Solomonic finding for both treatment strategies that gives us good reasons to follow up with both treatment strategies in clinical practice. But it shows, and this is an important information from this trial, that it is at least not inferior. Cryoablation is not inferior to radiofrequency ablation. Interesting and important result. I would like to close my presentation with a short look on new technologies, new horizons, new technologies for atrial fibrillation. And I would like to start off with mapping and ablation. We will see high-density mapping technologies and platforms that allow electrical insights into the mechanisms of arrhythmia with a spatial resolution that was impossible before these technologies were available. A decent map with electroanatomical mapping system consisted 25 to 50, maybe 80. High density was 200 points for a whole cardiac chamber. These technologies that have the ability to generate automatically multiple data from 8 pairs of electrodes set on 8 splines and implement these data into a dedicated annotation algorithm will completely change that and will allow us to take hundreds, thousands or 10,000s of data points in a relatively short period of time. Here you see the use of the system. The basket catheter is deployed in the right atrium. It's a remap of the right atrium. We are at 1 minute, no, we are at 27 seconds and have 1,000 automatically annotated electrograms, color-coded, depicted, clearly showing where conduction flows and clearly showing where diseased conduction can be anticipated. Focal arrhythmias can be nicely targeted with these technologies. And you have to understand that the annotation of the signal is fully automatic. 99% of all signals that go automatically into the system are correctly annotated. You see, this is a map of an atrial tachycardia with 8,000 mapping points that had been generated in 10 minutes. The technology has reached the field of atrial fibrillation ablation as well. You see the basket catheter now deployed in a patient with atrial fibrillation in the left-sided pulmonary veins, and you see that automatically acquired data show the strands of myocardium that run into the pulmonary veins. And it's easy to understand that it's relatively easy with these technologies to identify gaps in lesion lines around the pulmonary veins and to improve the efficacy of the procedure. Needless to say, it has to be shown that it's a tool and not a toy, but I personally believe that it offers new options. I close with the most fascinating new technology that I believe will come true in the foreseeable future, that is MRI interventional suites for electrophysiology and beyond. I believe that in 10 to 15 years from now, most cardiovascular interventions will be done in an MRI environment and no longer in classical cath labs. I would like to show you where we stand with this process. Again, I say with some proudness, the electrophysiologists on the planet are opening the doors and are the most advanced in the field of interventional MRIs. This is catheter ablation and MRI with passive catheter tracking. The first patient that we did 2.5 years ago at Heart Center Leipzig, you see the right ventricle, the right atrium. Here you can see the catheter and you see the distortion by the MRI, which is generated while scanning. However, we were able 2.5 years ago to give proof of concept that you can do these procedures in the MRI safely and effectively. With ablation, we either heat up or we cool down. With the MRI, you can visualize temperature gradients with a very, very high resolution, and you can see lesions growing while you're burning. And you can titrate the energy exactly to the extent that you would like to have it to have the optimal result. You can see your target tissue. You don't have to work with surrogates. We have put it to the next level very recently. This is now active tracking in the MRI. It's MRI based, as you can see on the right side of the picture. This is a whole organ scan which you can take in less than 2 minutes from the MRI, and that gives you the contour of the heart automatically and fully registered. And then you can move catheters with active tracking coils in the MRI. You don't even have to run the magnets on full power while doing so. This is one of the patients that underwent with active tracking catheter ablation of the right atrial isthmus recently at Heart Center Leipzig, and we will continue on that way, and I'm sure that we will approach atrial fibrillation and ventricular tachycardia soon. The last thing I want to close with is the outstanding potential that I see in the field of atrial fibrillation with new atrial fibrillation detection and monitoring technologies. These are the easiest wearables, and we are used to them quite nicely, Apple Watches and other watches. But this is just the beginning of a new era where wearables that will be able to detect and transmit automatically each and every signal will be used for biomonitoring and particularly for detection of atrial fibrillation. The most interesting I found was this one, which allows you to detect whatever you would like to detect at a very, very early stage. And this is a multi-purpose device that you can also use to prevent important people of saying less important things. Thank you so much.